A quiet stretch of Padre Island promised peace and open sky. Instead, it became the site of a chilling crime. Two RV travelers disappeared without warning. Their journey was meant to be freedom on the road. What followed exposed betrayal, violence, and a shocking motive hidden behind a friendly smile. Under the vast Texas sky, the open road represented freedom to many, but for one couple, it became a final journey. In October 2019, 48-year-old James Butler and his wife, 46-year-old Michelle Butler, left their home in Rumney, New Hampshire, intent on living a dream. James, a former U.S. Navy air traffic controller, and Michelle, equally committed to this chapter of their lives, had embraced the RV lifestyle. Their plan: drive their pickup truck towing their RV across the country, visit new places, and enjoy the calm and adventure of life on the move. They arrived in South Texas to a remote strip of beach on Padre Island, near Corpus Christi, in Claiborne County. The section of beach they chose was tucked behind sand dunes, known to locals as the Bowl, far from the bustle of typical tourist areas. They parked their vehicle, a silver Chevy pickup truck towing a white Cedar Creek RV, and settled in, possibly at what they expected would be a restful stop on their way south. At around midday on October 16th, James posted photos on social media of the RV parked by the shoreline and Michelle relaxing in a chair with her feet in the water. These images would later become vital for investigators. From that moment, however, contact between the couple and family began to fade. By October 23rd, their loved ones had not heard from them, raising alarm. Meanwhile, across the state border of everyday normalcy, two other travelers were on the move. 35-year-old Adam Curtis Williams of Logan, Utah, and his partner, 34-year-old Amanda Nover, also from Logan, were making their way with a different goal in mind. Williams had a criminal record and a past that included incarceration, and their journey together was shadowed by desperation. They arrived in the same region of South Texas, on the same beachfront stretch where the Butlers had parked. Williams had reportedly scoped the area, noting the couple's vehicle and RV setup. He engaged them in conversation, made friendly overtures, asked questions about where they were parked and how long they'd stay. On the surface, it looked like casual campground talk, but underneath it, the intention was far more sinister. The Butlers believed they were among fellow travelers, sharing the ease of the road, the open air, and the calm of camping near the sea. They had no reason to suspect danger. They were retirees who had reached a point in life where they could trade routine for mobility, the job stress behind them, the children grown and on their own. Michelle brought along their 3 cats. James and Michelle had married in 2015 and seemed to have found contentment in each other's company and in the simplicity of life in motion. As they settled for the evening in their remote dune-protected spot, Williams returned under cover of darkness. He armed himself, a 9mm weapon, and approached the quiet campsite. With the dunes and night assisting his move, Williams shot both James and Michelle in the head, killing them. Then Nover joined. The couple's bodies were buried in a shallow grave in the sand behind the dunes. The thieves took possession of the truck and RV. They fled, heading toward the Mexico border in the Florida-bound vehicle that belonged to the Butlers. In the days that followed, James and Michelle's absence became clear. Their family and friends were unable to reach them. Concern turned to desperation. The fiberglass of RV life that often suggests carefree openness now held a grim emptiness. Investigators, alerted by a ping of one of the victims' cell phones and by the social media post James had made, converged on the remote dune site between mile markers 263 and 264 on Padre Island. During initial investigation, a deputy spotted a bra covered in sand, the first visible clue. As they dug in the dune-protected area, they uncovered the body of a woman. Further excavation revealed the male victim's remains. Each had been stripped of identification, badly decomposed. The location, in a seldom trafficked section of beach, and the shallow grave indicated a calculated plan. Meanwhile, the stolen truck and RV crossed into Mexico and were captured on surveillance footage. The border crossing offered a trace point. Authorities released the pair's identities and distributed images showing Williams and Nover in the Butlers' vehicle. Mexican law enforcement and U.S. agencies coordinated. A park ranger and local business owner in the area reportedly recognized Williams from previously released images after he failed to wear a seatbelt, further tightening the net. A longtime friend of Nover contacted law enforcement, reporting her desire to leave Williams. This friend provided information about their whereabouts in an RV park in Jalisco, Mexico. With that lead, the pair were located and arrested. During all this, investigators documented the remote scene, the vehicle's movements, the stolen gear, the grave site, and the forensic evidence gathered. Family members launched social media campaigns. The missing persons report turned homicide investigation, and a community of RV travelers learned a tragic lesson about vulnerability on the road. What had begun as an adventure ended in betrayal, violence, and loss. This case reveals a stark contrast. A couple seeking freedom and renewal versus two individuals seeking gain at any cost. The theme is clear: trust misused, opportunity seized in darkness, and the fatal cost of meeting the wrong people in the open roads, open space. In that sense, the story is a cautionary one. The dream of travel and mobility carries risk, especially when others exploit hospitality, openness, and the unexpected. The Butlers' hopes for discovery turned into discovery of crime. Their path south became the site of a detailed manhunt. As investigators built the case, evidence mounted. The couple's family grieved while waiting for answers. The stolen RV and truck provided technical leads. The dune grave provided forensic material. The border crossing provided jurisdictional threads. The remote beach site provided isolation. The two suspects' shared background in travel gave them mobility. The victim's background in travel gave them openness. The events of those days in October 2019 left a lasting imprint on the communities of New Hampshire and Texas. From a peaceful RV stop to a grave in the sand, from a travel dream to a murder scene, the transformation was swift and brutal. When the bodies of James Butler and Michelle Butler were found in the shallow sand grave on Padre Island, the discovery marked a turning point. The quiet beach that had once been their scenic stopover had become a crime scene. The remote dunes, far from any crowds, now held evidence that would set off a multi-state investigation. Local deputies, Texas Rangers, and federal agents moved in, working carefully to recover the remains. The beach wind, shifting sand, and distance from main roads made the work slow. Their bodies had been buried just deep enough to conceal them, but not deep enough to withstand the natural erosion of the environment. The sand had shifted, revealing a hint of their presence. That was how investigators found them. The first priority was identification. At this stage, the victims were only unidentified remains. The decomposition and the stripping away of personal items meant there was no immediate confirmation. But at almost the same time the bodies were being unearthed, family members in New Hampshire were filing missing persons reports for James and Michelle. They hadn't heard from them since mid-October. Their messages had stopped abruptly. Their usual travel updates had gone silent. And the phone data showed their last known position near Padre Island. When investigators compared the missing persons case with the bodies located in the dunes, the connection quickly became clear. Dental and medical verification soon confirmed what everyone feared. The bodies were James and Michelle. With identification established, investigators turned to reconstructing the timeline. It was known that the couple had arrived at the beach and set up their RV near the dunes. They had likely expected a peaceful stop before continuing toward Florida. They had spoken with their family, shared photos of the ocean and the RV site, and nothing in their final communications suggested fear or concern. They were simply enjoying the lifestyle they had worked toward. Travel, simplicity, freedom. Their presence on the beach appeared entirely ordinary. The ordinary nature of their stay stood in sharp contrast to the events that followed. Investigators began interviewing others who had camped or traveled through the area. Several travelers recalled seeing another couple nearby, a man and a woman traveling together, staying in the same region of the beach. This man had introduced himself casually to other campers, appearing relaxed and friendly. This was Adam Curtis Williams. With him was Amanda Nover. Witnesses would later recall how Williams had paid attention to other RV setups, asking questions about travel plans and vehicles. Nothing in these interactions had raised alarm at the time. Among travelers, casual conversation is normal. People on the road share stories and tips. The Butlers, who were known for being welcoming and open, likely interacted with Williams in this same spirit. But investigators began to see a different pattern. This was not coincidence. Williams and Nover had been studying the Butlers' setup. The truck, the RV, the gear. The couple's location, tucked back from the main beach road, meant no one was watching. There were no close neighbors. The site was quiet enough that the sound of the waves could drown out almost anything. If someone wanted to act without drawing attention, this was the place to do it. The key breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered that the Butlers' truck and RV were missing. Their belongings were gone. Their campsite was disturbed. When law enforcement checked traffic and border surveillance, they found footage of the missing truck towing the RV. But the people inside the vehicle were not James and Michelle. It was Williams and Nover. This detail changed everything. The investigation shifted from identifying what happened to identifying who had done it. Now there were clear suspects, a clear motive, and a clear trail. The presence of the stolen truck crossing into Mexico triggered international involvement. U.S. Marshals, border agencies, and Mexican authorities worked together, sharing information. For investigators, the question was not whether Williams and Nover had taken the vehicle. It was how quickly they could be located and brought into custody. Meanwhile, forensic analysts worked the beach site. The burial showed intention. The shallow depth and hurried covering suggested the killers acted quickly, possibly at night. The couple had likely been murdered before they had any chance to call for help or defend themselves. The sand hid most evidence, but investigators collected what remained. Soil trace, shell casings, fabric fibers, and patterns of disturbance in the dunes. As they traced Williams and Nover into Mexico, investigators learned more about them. They were not casual travelers living freely on the road. They were moving often, staying temporary places, living with uncertainty. Williams had a criminal background. They had little stability, few resources, and no long-term plan. The Butlers' truck and RV represented more than belongings. They represented escape, security, and value. It became clear that Williams had approached the Butlers with purpose. Not conversation, not companionship, just opportunity. The investigation continued steadily. Law enforcement traced reports of the stolen truck at fuel stops. Travelers along the route recalled seeing the white RV at various campgrounds. Slowly, the picture sharpened. The couple had been killed, so their killers could take what they owned. This was not a crime of conflict or impulse. It was a theft motivated by need, carried out with violence, and covered by concealment. It was in Mexico that Williams and Nover's run began to close in. A tip came from someone who recognized Nover and reported that she wanted to leave the situation she was in. That information led authorities to a campground where the stolen vehicle was identified. Mexican authorities moved in, detained Williams, and later took Nover into custody. The arrests were made without resistance. From there, the process shifted to bringing the suspects back to Texas. Officials worked through the necessary procedures to have Williams and Nover transferred to the United States to face charges. While that unfolded, investigators continued building the case. They documented every step, the timeline of the Butlers' arrival, the interaction on the beach, the disappearance, the grave, the border crossing, the arrests. The work was careful, precise, and methodical. Every detail mattered. Meanwhile, family and friends of the Butlers gathered to mourn. Their loss reached beyond personal grief. To the traveling community, James and Michelle had represented something shared, trust in people met along the road, the belief that strangers could be kind, the idea that the world could be explored safely. Their deaths shook that belief. It introduced caution where there had once been openness. But the investigation had done its work. The suspects were in custody. And what happened next would move into the court system, where the truth of what occurred on Padre Island would be spoken plainly, and where responsibility would be assigned. After the arrests in Mexico, The case returned to Texas to move through the court system. The investigation had already formed a clear picture of what had happened on Padre Island, and now the legal process would place each detail into record. James and Michelle Butler had gone to the beach as travelers, expecting nothing more than a quiet stop by the ocean. Adam Curtis Williams and Amanda Nover had targeted them for the truck, the RV, and their belongings. The theft had been deliberate, and the murders had been the means. Once Williams and Nover were in custody, prosecutors began preparing the charges, shaping the evidence into a case that could be presented in court. Both suspects were questioned after being brought back to the United States. Investigators already had the timeline, the witness statements, the border footage, and the forensic evidence from the sand dunes. What remained was to confirm their roles. Over time, the statements given began to clarify the dynamic between the two. Williams was the one who had approached the Butlers, the one who had gathered information, and the one who had returned with a gun. Nover's involvement was tied to helping him bury the bodies and flee in the stolen vehicle. The motive was clear. They wanted the truck, the RV, and the couple's traveling supplies. There was no personal dispute, no argument, no misunderstanding. They wanted what the Butlers had, and they were willing to kill to take it. The legal proceedings began separately for each of them. With the weight of evidence against him, Williams faced the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors sought a capital murder conviction. For several months, pretrial filings and motions moved forward in the background, while family members of the Butlers waited for the day the case would be heard in court. Their grief had to exist alongside patience. They attended hearings, followed updates, and prepared to face the reality of testimony that would describe, in full detail, the last moments of James and Michelle's lives. As the case reached the point of trial preparation, Williams chose to plead guilty to capital murder. His plea removed the need for a lengthy trial and ensured that he would receive the most severe sentence available, without the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be released. Amanda Nover's case followed next. The evidence showed that she had been involved in the planning and the concealment, though she was not the one who pulled the trigger. The prosecution offered a plea deal that acknowledged her part without equating it to Williams's actions. She pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence reflected her involvement, but also acknowledged that she did not initiate or carry out the killings. Even with the lesser sentence, 20 years is a significant portion of a lifetime. She will not be free for a long time. When the sentences were read, the courtroom held a quiet that came from acceptance rather than relief. No outcome could restore what was lost. No sentence could replace the absence of James and Michelle. Their family members spoke about who the couple had been: kind, generous, steady people who had worked their entire lives for the chance to travel and see the country. They spoke of how James, after serving in the Navy as an air traffic controller, had looked forward to peace. They spoke of how Michelle had embraced the road with warmth and optimism. Their journey had not been one of escape, but one of fulfillment. The community of travelers, who had followed the case closely, also reacted to the sentencing. In the RV world, news travels fast. Campsites, online forums, and travel groups discuss the case for months. Many people who live on the road know the feeling of setting up camp beside strangers. They know the trust built between travelers who share advice, stories, and temporary space. The Butler story became a reminder that while most people on the road are genuine and friendly, the world still carries risk. Their deaths were mourned by people they had never met simply because their story represented something meaningful. The idea of living freely, without fear, and believing the journey itself is safe. After the case concluded, the dunes where the bodies were found remained quiet. The wind continued to move the sand. The ocean continued to wash the shore. The site did not become a memorial, but it did not return to ordinary. For those who knew the story, the landscape now held weight. The same openness that had drawn the Butlers, there had also provided cover for their killers. It was a reminder that beauty can hide danger, and that isolation can carry vulnerability. Yet the story of James and Michelle Butler is remembered not only for how their lives ended, but also for how they lived. They chose to see the country, to step away from routine, to build experiences rather than possessions. Their journey was shared openly, with photographs, messages, and check-ins with loved ones. Their lives held joy and movement and trust. The tragedy came not from their choices, but from crossing paths with people who valued none of those things. The conclusion of the case brought legal closure, but the emotional story remained. The Butlers family carried their memory forward. Other travelers carried caution forward. Law enforcement carried the details forward as an example of how investigation, cooperation, and persistence can bring resolution even across borders. The story held both heartbreak and clarity. In the end, the case of the Padre Island beach murders stands as a record of loss, of crime driven by greed, and of the distance between those who travel with openness and those who look for opportunities to exploit it. But it also stands as a testament to the ability of investigators and communities to bring truth to light, even when the setting is remote, the act concealed, and the answers buried beneath sand. In a quiet California neighborhood, a newlywed Marine couple built a life filled with hope. But one night, four fellow Marines crossed their threshold, bringing terror no one imagined. What unfolded was not only a deadly home invasion, but a betrayal that would shock a community and shake the meaning of loyalty itself. Jan Powell Piechak was 24 years old, a United States Marine sergeant stationed at Camp Pendleton in Southern California. He was born in Poland and later moved to the United States with his family, growing up with a strong focus on discipline, responsibility, and service. Friends described him as steady and thoughtful, someone who worked hard without seeking attention. He had a quiet confidence, a sense of humor that came out in low-key moments, and a pride in the work he did. In the Marines, he had gone through deployments and leadership roles that earned him respect among those who served with him. His life was moving forward in a promising direction. Kiana Jenkins Piechak was 26. She grew up in Southern California and had a warm, outgoing personality. She worked in the hospitality field and had a natural ability to make other people comfortable. She met Jan through mutual friends. The connection was immediate, not dramatic, but sincere and steady. They shared similar values, goals, and a practical view of building a life together. Early on, they understood that they could handle everyday challenges side by side. Their relationship was grounded in mutual respect and genuine affection. In August of 2008, Jan and Kiana married. They were still newlyweds when they moved into a small house in Winchester, in Riverside County. It was a quiet area, a place where young couples could start out without high living costs. The house was simple, but it represented their future. They were still arranging furniture, decorating the walls, and adjusting to married routines. Friends remembered the house as cozy and filled with excitement about what was ahead. There were photos, wedding cards, and gifts still being settled into place. At Camp Pendleton, Jan worked as a supervisor. Under his leadership were several younger Marines, including 4 men who would later become central to the crime. Tyrone Miller, age 20, Kevin Cox, age 20, Emery's John, 18, and Kassan Sykes, 21. They were lower-ranking Marines, still early in their careers. Each came from different parts of the country: North Carolina, Tennessee, Maryland, and California. They shared the usual stresses of military life: low pay, long hours, and the struggle for identity and belonging. None of them came from easy backgrounds. However, while many young Marines face similar circumstances, most find ways to adapt. These 4 did not. There were hints of frustration and resentment among them. Some felt they were looked down on. Others believed they deserved more money or status than they had. Jan, as a sergeant, had authority over them. There is no single clear moment when their thoughts turned into a criminal plan, but investigators later identified a motive built on robbery. The group believed that Jan and Kiana, newly married and living in a furnished home, must have valuables worth stealing. One or more of them had been inside the house before, possibly during casual social visits or work-related reasons. That familiarity created an opening. On the night of October 14, 2008, Moving into the early hours of October 15th, the four Marines made their decision. They gathered in a car, armed and masked. The plan was to force entry into the house, restrain the couple, and steal cash and property. What was already a serious crime became worse as the group discussed what to do if things did not go smoothly. At least some of them brought weapons not just for intimidation, but with the willingness to use them. Prosecutors later noted that the plan they formed allowed for violence from the beginning, even if robbery was the stated goal. Jan and Keanu were at home when the intruders arrived. The night was quiet, and the surrounding neighborhood was the kind where most people were sleeping. Once the four men reached the house, they broke inside. Jan and Keanu were quickly overwhelmed. The attackers tied them, gagged them, and began demanding access to valuables. The house, once a place of calm, became a scene of fear and domination. The couple did not stand a chance against four armed men who had come prepared and outnumbered them. What happened next went far beyond robbery. The intruders tortured both Jan and Keanu as they searched for money, jewelry, and items they believed were worth taking. During the assault, Keanu was sexually assaulted. Evidence found later showed that the violence was sustained and intentional, not a chaotic or impulsive act. The attackers controlled the house, moving from room to room, taking possessions and continuing the abuse. On the walls and surfaces of the home, racial slurs were spray-painted. The words targeted Jan and Keanu's interracial marriage. He was white, she was black. These markings suggested that at least one of the attackers acted with racial hostility. Whether the entire group shared that exact motive or whether it was used to degrade and terrorize the couple, the effect was the same: humiliation layered over violence. Investigators later described it as a crime meant not only to steal, but to degrade and destroy. Despite the brutality, the attackers did not want to leave witnesses. At the end of the ordeal, both Jan and Keanu were shot execution style. The shots were deliberate and final. After the murders, the attackers attempted to burn parts of the house to destroy evidence. The fires were small and did not spread far, but they showed intent to cover what had happened. Then the men gathered stolen property, wedding gifts, personal belongings, small valuables, and left. The house, once warm and newly settled, was silent. The violence that unfolded there contrasted sharply with the couple's life together. There was no struggle for power between them, no chaos. Their marriage had been stable and loving. The destruction of that life in a single night was devastating not only to their families, but to everyone who later learned the details. When neither Jan nor Keanu appeared for their usual responsibilities, people became concerned. Friends and co-workers tried to reach them, and eventually authorities were called to the home. The discovery was immediate and overwhelming. The scene revealed restraint marks, signs of struggle, and evidence of the fires that had been set. The spray-painted slurs were visible. The nature of the crime was clear. This was not a burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated invasion, followed by torture and murder. Investigators began collecting evidence from a scene, including fingerprints, DNA, and shoe impressions. As they documented the environment, they noted what was missing from the home. They learned that some of the missing items were unique and personal, things others would notice if suddenly acquired. At the same time, they began interviewing people connected to Jan, including the Marines he supervised. The process was careful and methodical. Early signs pointed to individuals who knew the couple and had knowledge of the home. The path from the crime scene to the suspect's barracks would be built piece by piece through physical evidence, forensic results, and witness statements. Those steps would come next. For now, what was known was that two people, newly married and preparing for a shared life, had been killed in their own home in a planned and violent crime. When investigators entered the Pietschak's home, the crime scene made its message clear. The house was not just the site of a robbery or a sudden act of anger. The scene reflected control, planning, and deliberate humiliation. Detectives moved carefully through the rooms, noting what had been disturbed and what had been taken. They recorded the spray-painted slurs on the walls, recognizing that these were not random markings. The words were targeted, personal, and degrading. They pointed to the fact that at least part of the motive involved hostility toward Jan and Kiana's interracial marriage. The brutality of the killings and the sexual assault reinforced that the violence had not happened in a hurry. The attackers stayed in the house long enough to harm, control, and intimidate their victims before the final shots were fired. The small fires set after the murders had mostly burned out on their own. They scorched sections of bedding and carpet, but did not destroy the interior of the home. Investigators understood that whoever set the fires intended to cover evidence, but either lacked the knowledge to make them spread or simply rushed out too quickly. Even with the attempt to burn evidence, the house still held a significant amount of forensic material. Investigators photographed footprints smeared in soot, lifted fingerprints from door surfaces, and collected trace fibers and biological samples. They documented everything with the expectation that at least some of it would connect to the attackers. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet. Many residents slept through the crime and had no idea what had happened until police cars gathered on the street. Winchester was not a place known for violence. Most people expected routine, ordinary life. To hear that a young couple had been murdered in their own home was unsettling for the community. As word spread, neighbors stepped outside, talked softly in driveways, and tried to understand how something so violent could take place so close to them. But the investigation did not stay focused on the neighborhood for long. It moved quickly to the people who had known Jan and might have known his schedule. Detectives spoke first with Jan's co-workers at Camp Pendleton. In the Marines, Jan was well regarded. He took his responsibilities seriously and treated those under him with fairness. The investigators needed to know who he interacted with most, whether he had disagreements, conflicts, or anyone who might have seen him as a target. Among the names that surfaced were 4 younger Marines who served under him: Tyrone Miller, Kevin Cox, Emery's John, and Kassan Sykes. All 4 had routine contact with January. They trained, worked, and lived in proximity. It did not take long for investigators to learn that these men also had a range of personal difficulties, disagreements, or challenges that could make them potential suspects, though nothing at this stage was being assumed outright. The investigation continued by analyzing the evidence taken from the home. Shoe impressions found on the floor were compared against standard military-issue footwear. This alone did not confirm who had been there, but it narrowed the category of possible suspects. The presence of military-style bindings and knots used to restrain the couple suggested familiarity with tactical restraint methods. Again, this was not proof, but it formed a pattern. The investigators also reviewed the missing items list. These were not high-value electronics or items that could be resold for large profit. They were mostly personal belongings, small valuables, and recognizable objects from the wedding. These items were difficult to hide without someone noticing. Meanwhile, in the barracks at Camp Pendleton, life continued as usual on the surface. Routine drills, inspections, and daily responsibilities kept everyone in motion. However, rumors began to move through the ranks. News of the murder spread quickly among Marines who had known January. Many felt shock and sadness. Others whispered about possibilities, questioning whether someone from the base could have been involved. These were quiet conversations, spoken after formation or in shared common spaces, but the speculation was enough for investigators to hear about it during interviews. That is when detectives began to focus more closely on Miller, Cox, John, and Sykes. Each of the 4 Marines had different personalities and backgrounds, but they were often seen together. They shared time off base, and some had financial pressure or frustrations regarding pay and promotions. The investigators learned that 1 or more of them had been inside Jan and Kiana's home previously. That detail stood out. Knowing the layout of the house made the forced entry easier and the assault more controlled. The case was no longer focused on possibility. It became focused on connection. Detectives obtained search warrants for the barracks rooms. When they entered, they were looking specifically for stolen items. The search produced results. Wedding gifts and property belonging to Jan and Kiana were found in spaces connected to the 4 Marines. These were distinct items, not easily explained by coincidence. The investigators also recovered weapons, clothing, and other materials that matched the crime scene characteristics. The presence of stolen property shifted the case significantly. It provided physical evidence linking the barracks to the house. Once the evidence was collected, the investigators began interviewing the suspects. Each Marine was questioned separately. The interviews were direct but calm, focused on timelines, movements, and actions on the night of the murders. Some of the suspects tried to distance themselves from the event, offering vague explanations or placing themselves elsewhere. Others appeared nervous as the questioning continued. The detectives did not reveal all the evidence they had at once. They asked structured questions, observing reactions more than words. The goal was to see who would reveal inconsistencies. As more evidence came together, a clearer narrative formed. The 4 Marines had left the base together around the time of the crime. Their movements aligned with travel to Winchester. Their possessions contained stolen items. Their footwear matched impressions in the house. The case no longer depended on speculation or hearsay. The evidence spoke directly. One of the key investigative points was that the crime showed organization. The forced entry, the restraints, the method of attack, and the effort to conceal evidence indicated planning. The investigators believed that this was not a spontaneous crime rooted in impulse, but a robbery prepared in advance. But there was also the element of racial hostility, demonstrated through the slurs spray-painted in the home. Investigators could not determine exactly when, during the crime, the slurs were written, but they recognized the significance. Jan and Keanu had never expressed fear or concern about racial harassment. Their relationship was open, ordinary, and accepted among those who knew them. The attackers' use of racial insults pointed to animosity that may have influenced how the violence unfolded. While the primary motive was robbery, the humiliation and degradation added another dimension that disturbed investigators and prosecutors deeply. As the investigation progressed, the families of Jan and Keanu were informed of developments. Both families were devastated. For Jan's relatives, the loss of their son, who had traveled so far in life and served his adopted country, carried a painful irony. For Keanu's family, the shock of losing a daughter known for kindness and warmth was unbearable. The racist markings inside the house brought an added level of pain and anger. The families had to confront not only the loss, but the cruelty behind it. Public awareness grew as news reports began covering the case. The idea that 4 Marines, men trained to serve and protect, were suspected of invading a fellow Marine's home and killing him and his wife caused a strong reaction. The story challenged the public's sense of military honor and discipline. It revealed that even within institutions known for structure and camaraderie, individuals could commit acts of extreme violence for personal gain. Once the suspects were formally connected to the crime, the investigation phase began to move toward building a legal case. This meant gathering final forensic confirmations, establishing timelines with precision, and preparing the case for court. The evidence would need to clearly show involvement, planning, and intent. The legal process would unfold over time, requiring careful presentation of every detail. But the final outcome of that process would come later. The arrests were only the turning point. The next steps, confessions, trials, rulings, and sentencing, would determine how the men responsible would be held accountable. As the investigation moved forward, the arrests of the 4 Marines brought the case into the courtroom. The defendants were no longer just names in a report. They were men who had trained alongside Jan, shared the same base, and had once saluted the same flag. Now they were accused of invading his home, torturing him and his wife, and taking their lives. The legal process required patience, evidence, and careful presentation. Detectives, forensic specialists, family members, and military personnel all became part of the long path toward accountability. The prosecution built its case around several core elements: the physical evidence recovered from the home, the stolen items found in the barracks, the timeline that placed all 4 men away from base on the night of the murders, and statements the men made both before and after the crime. The shoe prints matched the same type of boots issued in their unit. The bindings used to restrain Jan and Kiana reflected military-style knotting. The stolen personal items, including wedding gifts and belongings with clear sentimental value, connected the crime scene directly to their living quarters. These were items that no outsider would have taken unless they had known the couple or had some reason to be inside their home. The prosecution also introduced testimony regarding comments made by the defendants after the crime. One witness described hearing one of the men congratulate another as though they had accomplished something significant. It was not an expression of panic or regret. It was voiced with pride. That detail disturbed jurors and supported the prosecution's argument that the killings were not the result of panic or loss of control, but rather carried out with purpose. During the trial, the racial slurs spray-painted in the home were also discussed. While the central motive remained robbery, the presence of those words showed that the attackers had chosen to degrade Jan and Kiana in a deeply personal way. Prosecutors argued that even if racial hostility was not the primary reason for the crime, it influenced how the victims were treated. The humiliation, the violence, and the cruelty all pointed to intent that went beyond theft. The families of Jan and Kiana attended the hearings. They listened as the details of the crime were described in precise, clinical language. The forensic reports, the timeline reconstructions, and the discussion of the physical injuries forced them to relive the loss in an environment where emotions were restrained by legal procedure. Family members spoke quietly in hallways, holding each other and trying to stay present through testimony that no parent or loved one should have to hear. They remained there because they needed to see the process through to the end. When the verdicts were delivered, they came with weight. The jury found the defendants guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and burglary. The presence of multiple special circumstances elevated the severity of the charges. These included the fact that there were 2 victims, that the murders occurred during the commission of a robbery, and that torture had taken place in the home. At sentencing, the courtroom changed from a place of examination to a place of reckoning. Family members were given the opportunity to address the court. Kiana's mother spoke about her daughter's warmth and her daily visits to the cemetery. She described the quiet that replaced her daughter's voice in her life. Jan's mother spoke of the loss of her only son, a child she had raised with care and pride, who had chosen to serve in the military and had built a life built on discipline and love. Their words were not dramatic. They were quiet, direct, and filled with pain that could not be measured. The judge who presided over the case acknowledged the family's grief and the nature of the crime. He described the home invasion as calculated, planned, and carried out with the precision of trained men who understood how to control and overpower others. He called the crime one of the most disturbing acts he had seen in his courtroom. The sentences reflected the severity of the crime. 2 of the defendants received the death penalty. Another was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The final defendant also received a death sentence after the conclusion of his proceedings. The legal outcomes did not bring back Jan and Kiana. They did not repair the lives of their families, but they formally recognized the harm, and they ensured that the men responsible would never again walk freely. In the years following the trial, the case has continued to stand out not just because of its brutality, but because of the betrayal at its core. Jan was a sergeant. The men who killed him had once stood at attention under his direction. The military is built on trust, loyalty, and shared purpose. This crime shattered those values. It highlighted how power and training can be twisted when guided by greed and resentment rather than discipline and integrity. The story of Jan and Kiana is not defined by how they died, but by how they lived. They were young, hopeful, building a future, and doing so with kindness and commitment to each other. Their deaths expose the capacity for cruelty that can exist even within institutions known for honor. Their lives, however, remain the center of the story. 2 people who began a marriage with joy, only to have it cut short in an act of senseless and devastating violence. The conclusion of the case did not offer closure in the way people often imagine. Their families continued to carry their memories, their loss, and the weight of what had happened. But the truth was told, evidence was heard, and justice, as defined by the courts, was carried out. The final result stood as a record, a warning, and a reminder of how quickly trust can be broken and how deeply violence can reach into ordinary lives. On a quiet winter night in Springfield Township, 2 young lives were taken inside a home that should have been safe. No forced entry, no warning, just silence, duct tape, and unanswered questions. What happened inside that house, and why, would haunt a community long before the truth came to light. In late January of 2011, in Springfield Township near Toledo, Ohio, 2 young people were living what looked like an ordinary winter night. Johnny Clark was 21, outgoing, known for being social and quick to laugh. His girlfriend, 20-year-old Lisa Straub, was calm, thoughtful, and close with her family. She worked part-time as a server at TGI Fridays while taking college classes, staying at her parents' home while they were away on a short trip. The house stood in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and neighbors who were used to peace and routine evenings. Nothing about that night suggested danger. Nothing suggested that the home would soon become the center of a brutal crime scene that would shake the local community. Johnny and Lisa had spent that evening much like many young adults their age. Lisa had worked her shift, and Johnny had picked her up afterward. They returned to the Straub home to spend the night together. The house was comfortable, familiar, and safe. A place where Lisa had grown up and where her parents trusted her to be responsible. The lights were on indoors. The couple relaxed, used their phones, and moved through the last hours of the night with no reason to fear what was coming. But while the home felt safe, there were others who believed the house held cash or valuables worth stealing. Whether it was rumor, assumption, or information passed along by someone else, the idea that the Straub home had money inside set the stage for a robbery. The motive would be simple: get in, steal what could be found, and leave. What happened instead was far more violent and senseless. Johnny's mother had grown uneasy earlier that night. It was not uncommon for her to worry. Mothers worry as part of instinct. But something about the silence felt wrong. She tried to reach Johnny, and when she couldn't, she called 911. The first call went out around 1:21 in the morning. It was a call made not because she knew something was happening, but because she felt something was. Officers went to the house and did not see anything disturbing from outside. There was no broken window, no visible struggle. The house looked calm. Without cause to enter, they left. Time passed. The quiet continued. The worry grew. She called again at 2:06 a.m. Still, nothing clear enough to prompt forced police action. But by 3:50 a.m., the fear turned urgent. The final call described the belief that Johnny and Lisa were tied up in the basement and unresponsive. This time the situation could not be brushed aside as nerves. This time, Johnny's father and mother rushed to the house themselves. They did not wait for permission. Johnny's father forced the door open. Inside, the silence was no longer calm. It was thick, heavy. A feeling that something was terribly wrong filled the air before anything was seen. They searched quickly, calling for their son and for Lisa. They found them not in the basement, but upstairs. Both were bound. Their hands were tied behind their backs with black duct tape. Plastic bags were sealed over their heads. The tape crossed their necks tightly. There were no signs of struggle strong enough to have freed them. They were no longer alive. The shock in that room was overwhelming. It was a kind of scene that no family should ever have to witness. The parents immediately called for help. Authorities soon arrived again, this time entering to find what had already become clear. The house that had seemed so normal hours before was now a crime scene. The calm outside had hidden violence inside. Investigators moved room to room. The upstairs bedroom showed signs of intrusion. Drawers were open. Items had been moved or thrown aside. A dresser had been disturbed, and furniture was out of place. On the floor was spilled soil from a drop plant. There were 2 damaged cell phones. One had been thrown and broken. Another was found soaked in water, as if someone wanted to prevent calls from being made. The home did not show typical signs of forced entry from the outside. There were no broken windows or kicked-in doors before Johnny's father forced it himself. This meant whoever had entered either came in because the door was unlocked, was allowed inside, or found some other subtle way in. That detail raised questions from the start. The condition of Johnny and Lisa told investigators how the final moments unfolded. The duct tape was applied with care and intent. Their hands were tied behind their backs in a way that prevented movement. The plastic bags over their heads were sealed tightly enough that breathing would have become impossible. The deaths were not quick. They were controlled, deliberate, and personal. Someone had wanted to silence them completely. This was not a situation in which violence erupted during a struggle. There were no signs suggesting the couple fought back in a prolonged physical fight. This was binding, restraint, and suffocation. It implied the attackers wanted control. They wanted obedience. It also suggested something had gone wrong. If the plan had simply been to rob the house, killing 2 young adults did not serve any practical purpose. The deaths made the crime far riskier. Yet the deaths happened anyway. The neighborhood woke the next morning to police cars and caution tape. Neighbors who had slept soundly the night before stepped outside to learn that something awful had been happening while they rested in their warm homes. The story spread quickly. A double homicide of 2 young adults in a quiet area where people did not lock doors because they trusted their surroundings. Suddenly, trust itself was gone. Friends and family gathered, struggling to understand. Johnny had plans. Lisa had plans. Their lives were not chaotic or dangerous. There was no reason for either to be targeted for something like this. Their parents were devastated. Their friends were lost for words. The community was shaken to know that such violence could come into a peaceful home without warning. Nothing felt random, yet no clear reason emerged. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of the night. Phone records, call logs, Lisa leaving work, Johnny picking her up, the quiet after their return home, the first 911 call, the second, the final desperate one. These small details became markers. Investigators gathered fingerprints, took photographs, studied the direction of drawers being pulled, identified where footsteps had tracked through the house. They collected evidence from the hallway and the bedroom floors. Every object was examined because every detail could matter. One piece of evidence would eventually become important, though its meaning would not be revealed until later. It was a cigarette, but found in the hallway upstairs. At that moment in the investigation, it was only another item among many collected and bagged. The significance of it would not be understood until further analysis. As news outlets learned about the crime, the story began to spread beyond the county. It was the kind of case that caught attention because it violated expectations. Young couple, safe home, no warning, violence that made no sense. People wanted answers, but there were none yet. Investigators did not present suspects publicly. They worked methodically, returning to the house again and again, retracing the final hours. In the days that followed the discovery of Johnny Clark and Lisa Straub, Springfield Township was filled with confusion and grief. The Straub home remained sealed, guarded, and under constant examination. Detectives, forensic technicians, and evidence teams moved methodically from one room to the next, documenting every inch. The house was no longer simply a family home. It had become the starting point of a long and difficult search for answers. The first focus of investigators was understanding how the intruders gained entry. There were no broken windows and no doors forced open before Johnny's father arrived and kicked in the locked door. This suggested one of several possibilities. The intruders had entered earlier in the evening when the door may have been unlocked. They were let in by someone the couple knew, or they had found a subtle way inside without leaving obvious damage. Investigators questioned neighbors about anything unusual before or during the night. Some had heard small sounds, something like a bump or a thud, but nothing alarming. No one reported loud shouting, breaking glass, or anything that suggested a violent struggle. That quietness pointed toward the killers being calm, controlled, and confident in what they were doing. attention then shifted to the condition of the rooms. The upstairs bedroom where Johnny and Lisa were found showed signs of a hurried search. Drawers had been opened and items had been moved, but the house was not torn apart in a chaotic way. It appeared that the intruders had been looking specifically for valuables, cash, or possibly a safe. Whether they believed there would be large amounts of money in the house, or were acting on information they thought was reliable, remained unknown. But the pattern suggested intent. This was a planned home invasion, not something impulsive. Investigators collected fingerprints, but not all prints helped. Some belonged to the couple, some to family members, and others to visitors who had no involvement. The real challenge was separating criminal traces from everyday life. Crime scene technicians also documented the duct tape used to restrain the victims. The tape was wrapped firmly and evenly, suggesting the person or persons applying it were not acting out of panic. The plastic bags placed over the victims' heads were sealed tightly. Everything pointed to someone who had done something like this before, or at least had the patience and presence to carry out a controlled attack. One detail, nearly overlooked at first, became part of the evidence inventory. A cigarette, but found on the floor in the upstairs hallway. Neither Johnny nor Lisa smoked. That meant whoever smoked the cigarette was likely inside the house during the crime. It was collected, labeled, and stored for testing. No one at that moment knew how important it would become later. While investigators worked inside the house, they also began looking at the social connections of both victims. They interviewed friends, co-workers, acquaintances, and relatives. The goal was not only to learn if the couple had any conflicts, but also to find out who might have known about the house, their schedule, or rumors of valuables. Investigators learned that the Straub family was not wealthy. There were no hidden stacks of cash. Whatever motive led the attackers, there had been based on a belief rather than fact. That raised the question of where the belief came from. Detectives examined phone records from both Johnny and Lisa. Calls, texts, and messages were reviewed to see if anyone had contacted them before the attack or attempted to lure them into unlocking the door. Nothing clear appeared at first. The final hours of their lives seemed ordinary. They returned home after Lisa's shift. They relaxed. They used their phones. No sign of fear or warning showed up in their messages. A crucial part of the early investigation was the timeline of the 911 calls. Johnny's mother's repeated attempts to get help revealed that something felt wrong long before the bodies were discovered. But the officers who first responded saw nothing from outside that warranted a forced entry. This led to frustration and heartbreak later. But in the moment, the police were operating under standard procedure. There had been no visible signs of a crime in progress. When Johnny's parents forced entry themselves and discovered the bodies, the situation changed instantly. The emotional weight of those events hung over the investigation. Everyone involved understood how close the response had come to being sooner, yet also how impossible it was to know what was happening inside that house without evidence or sound from within. Those hours became one of the most painful questions in the aftermath. If the door had been opened earlier, could something have been prevented? The next weeks moved slowly. Investigators conducted interviews again and again, looking for contradictions or new details. They asked about friendships, past disagreements, money owed, or arguments. The couple's friends described them as joyful, affectionate, and excited about their future. Their families described them as loving, responsible, and present. There were no clear signs of dangerous people around them. News coverage continued to grow, and the case drew attention across Ohio. Candlelight gatherings were held. Photos of the couple appeared in local media, showing Lisa smiling gently and Johnny with an easy, relaxed expression. People in the area locked their doors more often. The idea that two young adults could be killed quietly in a home so familiar shook people deeply. Safety no longer felt like something that could be taken for granted. As the investigation continued, forensic testing moved forward. Physical evidence had to be analyzed carefully. Every fingerprint, fiber, and biological trace had to be reviewed and compared. The cigarette butt from the hallway underwent DNA extraction and profiling. At the same time, Investigators looked into reports of burglary attempts, theft rings, or local individuals known for breaking into homes. The focus was on the possibility that the criminals were not strangers to the area. Detectives also studied whether more than one person had been involved. The bindings and control necessary to restrain two healthy young adults suggested that more than one perpetrator could have been present. But no visible footprints or clear sets of fingerprints proved how many intruders were in the home that night. The house had been lived in normally up until the attack, making it difficult to isolate traces. At this stage, there was no public announcement of suspects. The community waited, hoping for progress. The families, though devastated, cooperated fully. They answered every question, repeated every memory, provided every detail. They wanted justice, but they also wanted accuracy. The truth mattered. They did not want assumptions. They wanted facts strong enough to hold up in court. Over time, investigators began to focus on individuals with past criminal backgrounds, particularly those connected to people who knew the victims. They tracked rumors, examined connections, and continued forensic work. Meanwhile, the families were learning how to live with the absence of Johnny and Lisa. Each day was a reminder of what had been taken. The story at this point was defined by loss, unanswered questions, and the slow, careful work of investigation. The community continued to support the families. The police continued to piece together evidence. And the case moved quietly and steadily toward a point where the truth would begin to surface. As weeks turned into months, the case continued to move forward, guided by patience and careful forensic review. The cigarette, but collected from the hallway, finally returned a DNA result. The profile matched a man named Samuel Sam Williams, who was in his early 20s at the time. He had prior run-ins with the law and was known in certain circles for involvement in crimes connected to break-ins and theft. The discovery did not answer every question, but it placed him inside the house during the night of the murders, and that was a critical step. Investigators did not rush to act. They wanted to make sure that every piece of evidence they brought forward was supported, clear, and strong. Detectives set out to learn more about Williams' movements and his associations. They found that he had been connected to people who had social links to the victims, not directly through friendship, but through the complicated paths of acquaintances and passing conversations. This provided a possible explanation for why the Straub home was targeted. Someone believed there was money there. Whether the rumor was exaggerated or misunderstood did not matter anymore. It had been enough to draw someone into the house that night. As investigators continued building the timeline, they also reviewed the state of the house once again, now with a clearer idea of what they were looking for. They looked at the broken cell phones, the drawers pulled out, and the tight bindings. The way the tape was wrapped suggested confidence and time taken. The attack had not been rushed. They believed that the intruders expected compliance, expected to get information, and expected to leave without being confronted. But something changed in that moment. The couple either resisted, or the intruders decided that the only way to leave without risk was to silence them. It was a decision made in cold calculation rather than impulse. With the DNA match and supporting evidence, investigators presented the case to the local prosecutor. It was enough to move forward. A warrant was issued and Samuel Williams was arrested. When he was brought in, he denied involvement. He did not admit to being in the house. But the DNA was clear. The cigarette, but had not placed itself in the hallway. It had not landed there during any normal visit. It had been smoked and left during the time of the crime. The case moved to trial. The courtroom was filled with the families of Johnny and Lisa. They sat quietly, carrying the weight of grief that does not fade. The prosecution laid out the evidence carefully and plainly. They detailed the timeline. They showed photographs of the crime scene. They explained the duct tape, the plastic bags, and the positions in which the bodies were found. They presented the DNA from the cigarette, and the physical evidence that matched Williams' presence in the house. The defense argued that the DNA did not prove he committed the murders. They suggested that someone else could have placed him there at another time. They questioned whether the bindings meant the same person who entered the house was the one who killed the couple. But the overall circumstances were too direct to ignore. The timing, the evidence, and the nature of the crime aligned in a way that did not leave much room for reasonable doubt. The families listened to every word. They did not interrupt. They did not react loudly. Their grief was steady and contained, the way grief sometimes can be when it has gone on long enough to turn into endurance. The jury listened too, taking in each detail piece by piece. The courtroom atmosphere remained calm, but beneath that calm was the understanding that the case mattered deeply to everyone present. When the jury returned with a verdict, the outcome was clear. Samuel "Sam" Williams was found guilty of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and aggravated burglary. The evidence had shown he was in the house, that the crimes were controlled and intentional, and that the deaths were caused by deliberate suffocation. The motive remained robbery. Whatever the attackers believed they would gain had never been found. The plan had cost 2 young lives and brought no reward. During sentencing, the judge spoke plainly. The deaths of Johnny Clark and Lisa Straub had been brutal, permanent, and without justification. Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The punishment reflected the severity of the crime and the irreplaceable loss suffered by the families. In the time that followed, the families focused on remembering Johnny and Lisa as they lived, not as they died. They remembered Lisa's caring nature, her steady personality, and her closeness to her parents. They remembered Johnny's energy, his humor, and the way he drew people in. Friends remembered late-night conversations, plans for the future, and everyday moments that seemed ordinary at the time but had become precious memories. The case left a lasting impact on Springfield Township. For many, it changed how they locked their doors and how they viewed safety in familiar spaces. The quiet suburban streets did not look the same. But more importantly, it reminded people how quickly life can change, how fragile normal evenings can be, and how the simplest assumptions about safety can be broken. In the years since the trial, the memory of Johnny and Lisa has remained strong among those who love them. Their families continue to honor them, and their story stands as a reminder of the value of lives interrupted too soon. It is a story of loss, investigation, and justice carried out not with haste, but through careful work and unwavering commitment to the truth.